Let's see another interesting way to write loops on array or linked list. And this is analogous to the for each loop in Java, in case you have used them before. Okay, let's now go back to our test library class over here. And what we would like to do is to set up another test at the end. Okay, so now let's just type at the end over here. And then let me call that test across loops. And then it's going to be a Boolean query because we don't expect any violation to happen. I will declare the local variables in a moment, but always put the comments first. Okay, I'm going to say, let me just copy the name of the query here and then paste it. Okay, colon here. And then let's say use of across, which I'll explain in a moment, which is keyword of across as instruction, as loop instructions. Okay, let me show you how you can use the code completion in Visual Studio to help you develop that. However, you gotta understand exactly how that works. So let's say simply type the word across and then hit enter. So this is the skeleton that is generated for you from Visual Studio. Let's now understand each bit of that particular structure before we come back to the coding. Okay, let me switch to my iPad. So I want you to look at the left-hand side only. The right-hand side is something I would recommend, but left-hand side first. For the left-hand side, you can see specifically, you can see once we type across, and then it generates something with S, loop, and end. So that's the skeleton. Okay. So there are several pieces you have to fill in. Across something over here, S something else, and also do something over here. Right. That's why you have to fill in. Let me explain bits by bits over here. So this particular item over here is actually for you to specify something that's iterable. So what are the iterable objects? For example, any collection like an array, linked list, or hash table from the info base is iterable. And you can also make your own class iterable. And we'll talk about it, so-called the iterated pattern later in the lecture. Okay, any collection or integer interval. For example, you may want to say, I want to go over the interval between the lower and upper indices of an array. Okay, and then, so that's about the first part. Just any iterable object over here should be the first part. And now this one over here is to have a dummy variable or local variable. So there's going to be some new dummy or local variable. Okay, and then over here you're simply just going to do the body of the loop. Okay, that's the rough structure. And however, there's one thing very important to tell you. Notice what's the difference between this block over here and this block over here. For this block, I actually included the keyword as versus is. They make a difference. Okay, the default generated block actually give you the S version over here. Okay, let's see what that means. Whatever local variable you declare over here in this block over here, for example, I. Let's say if you say I is assuming that there's no local variable or attribute name that clash with I over here. So now the I over here, okay, let me write it down explicitly. I denotes a cursor pointing to a member of the iterable collection. And the iterable collection is whatever we specify in the green over here. Okay, that's the idea you should know. And the most important part to note is actually a cursor rather than just a value. For example, if you got an iterable collection of strings, so I over here is not going to refer to a string value, but rather a cursor to string. Okay, so that's why I will recommend once you get the across, if you want to use a cross loop, if they actually generate this S version for you, if you know what you're doing, that's fine. I'm going to show you what the common mistake you might make. However, I would suggest you actually simply, the first thing you do is to modify from S into is. Okay, once you have done that, everything else stay the same except what's going to be the interpretation for whatever dummy variable it is over here. Right? You still specify some iterable collection here, the same, and also the body of the loop over here. But now the difference is over here, whatever dummy variable I you specify over here is going to have a different meaning. So this one here is going to be simply a member of, rather than a cursor to, a member of the iterable collection. Okay, that's just conceptual. Just want to go over with you what really is the fundamental difference between as versus is. Okay, I'm going to demonstrate to you. But now here, hopefully you see the idea. So now let's see how we can use it. Okay, let's go back to the code, iPhone Studio, and let's use this version over here specifically, just as, and then I'll show you how you can use it. Okay, let's declare some local variable for us to manipulate. Let's just do array, and then we'll copy array into linked list. Let's say you can do other combination as well. Let's say a, we declare some local variable a of type array of string. Again, I'm doing a string just example type. The member type over here can be anything, can be primitive like integer, boolean, character, or it can be also reference type like a string, person, account, or birthday. Okay. Let's now declare two lists over here. That's going to be handy for us. List 1, list 2, linked list of the same type, string. Okay. Just make sure everything, oh, of course it wouldn't compile because we haven't completed this yet. That's fine. Okay, let me show you the easiest one. So what can be an iterable collection? I mentioned that iterable collection can either be a integer interval, or it can be a collection, like an array or linked list. Why don't we do integer interval first? That's the easier one to actually specify. The syntax would be, you just have to give a lower bound and also upper bound. Let me do the simplest example. If I do, let's say from 1 over here until, let's say we want to go over the array A. Okay, actually let me initialize A first. There's another notation which I didn't show you in the previous video. This is how you can initialize an array directly if you know exactly what the elements are. So I can say array A is assigned to, so now angle brackets is the one you need. It's similar to the correspondence, you gotta use the curly brackets in Java, right? So a similar idea. So let's say we have an array of string. Let's say Alan, also Mark, and also Tom. So we got an array of size 3 over here. Okay, and then let's say here we want to go across the interval of the indices. So that'd be from 1 until a.count. So lower bound, upper bound. So far, it's very straightforward. And then we have to declare some dummy variable, as I said. We can say I here is a very typical name. You know, if you study math, I is a very typical dummy variable name. However, I would suggest you may want to have some prefix, for example, L underscore standing for local, just in case. Let's say if you're ready, let me show you why. Let's say, so far, let's say if it compiles. So far, everything compiles. However, let's say if you forgot, you also got another loop counter over here that's also called I. Then now you will have a compile time error because now you have local loop variable, which is I, clashes with the local variable I over here. So it wouldn't be allowed. So I would suggest that every time if you want to introduce a dummy variable within the across, you may just want to give some prefix just to avoid compilation error, unless you know you wouldn't have clash. Okay, that's something to note. Okay, so now li is very important to note over here. Li denotes a cursor pointing to an integer. Remember I said before, it's going to be a cursor pointing to a member of the iterable collection. In this case, it's an iterable collection of integers. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 until the size of the array, the upper bound. So each member there is actually an integer. However, li over here is not denoting exactly just the number directly, but rather indirectly is a cursor to the integer. Okay. So now to be more precise over here, let me just draw some illustration for you. Okay. So now let's think about it. Let me just open a new page over here and show to you. So when I say across, let me just make it more concrete. Let's say 1, 2, 1 to 5. So vertical bar dot dot vertical bar. As let's say local variable I, and then we say loop do something here and then end, right? What it does for this part over here is it basically creates an interval, right? You can think about interval is simply just like an array or linked list, right? Let me just draw it like an array. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? In this case, your lower bound is 1, upper bound is 5. And then Li over here is not like this. You might think Li is simply just pointing to the member of some member of the array. It's not the case, okay? Instead, Li should be visualized like this. Li is actually pointing to indirectly an integer cursor objects, where that one there has something called item. Item there is actually integer cursor is actually pointing to some integer value over here. In order to really, for example, if currently it is really pointing to 1 here, in order to retrieve the value there, you cannot just say Li. Li is referring to the integer cursor. In order to retrieve the value over here, you have to say li.item. So that's the additional complication you have to deal with if you actually use the S version over here. If you didn't, you're going to get compilation error. I'm going to show you right away. Okay, so just always remember this visualization over here to remember in the case of the S version over here, it's going to give you an integer cursor rather than integer or the member type directly. Okay, let's go back to iFlow Studio. Let's see this. Okay, let me show you the correct version, and then I will make it uncompilable just to show you. So let's say I want to copy every string in array A over here, Alan, Mark, and Tom, into list 1 over here. We did something very similar. So let's see how we can use to do it, achieve the same thing by using a cross. So what I want to first do is to initialize list 1. Otherwise, we got a void safety issue. So create list1 dot make to create an empty list, right? To start, we'll start with that. Okay, just make an empty line here so you can see more clearly. So now what we want to do now is to gradually extend list 1 over here as the body of the loop dot extend. Okay, what should we extend? So now Li is now going to, okay, thinking this way. Okay, so for in total, since we got 3 elements in the array, okay, so but each time is going to point to a particular element in the array, and then the second iteration is going to point to another element, and the third iteration is going to point to another one, right? Each one is going to move gradually from left to right, linearly. So what we should do is we should conceptually should be quite easy for you to think. I can simply just say li, but it should be whatever element that's pointed by the cursor. So I should say li.item. So that's exactly how I explained it before. You have to say li.item over here, right? Otherwise, you're only referring to just the cursor object, which is not right. Let me go back here. Okay, so that's the way to go. And notice one thing. One advantage of using a cross is you don't have to worry about incrementing the loop counter because it's guaranteed to terminate. When you say you're going to go across this particular interval, it's guaranteed to tell you it's going to go from 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to 8 count. Okay, it's not going to go more or less iterations. Okay, so let's just compile that and then make sure everything is good. Okay, let's see what happened here. So li.item is simply just an index, actually the integer index. But now we want to use the index to index into the array, which is A. Okay, so now what I should do is I should really try to say A over here of at index this. Okay, if I say compile, that is fine. Let me try to write a test, and then I will show you the one that's very commonly mistaken by students. So I can say result is assigned to, for example, list1.count is equal to 3, and also list at index 1 should be Alan, and list at position 2 should be tilde equal Mark, and also list at position 3 tilde equal Tom. List 1. Okay, You can see what I'm really doing here. I hope you will do as well. Make sure you compile every 2 or 3 changes you're making, right? So I can make mistake. That's okay as long as soon as I see any compilation errors, I can fix them right away. Okay, I also need to make sure I include this particular feature for execution in the test cases, right? And then we'll run the workbench system. So add Boolean case agents test across loops. Okay, and then I'll say compile. Let's run the workbench system. Okay, my browser is here. Okay, so now everything works. Okay, that's our new test case over here, test across loops. Okay, that's good. So now let's go back to iPhone Studio. And now what we want to do is to develop further. Oh, before we do that, I want to show you a common mistake. You can see what we're doing here is S, so li is actually integer cursor. That's why we have to say li, the item here. So I would say this is not intuitive. To be honest with you, much more often, even myself, I would intend to do something like this, li. I would think li is simply referring to the integer, which can be a member of this particular interval from 1 to a count. So I'll say li here. If you do it, in that case, if you try to compile, that's a very common mistake you will have. It's a non-compilable actual argument in feature call. It doesn't say much, but if you expand it over here, it tells you more. Okay, so now if you look at that over here, let me just show you here. So here we're using the indexing notation. So what we're expecting within the square brackets is an integer. However, compiler, you can read a little bit more detail, is complaining that the actual argument type over here is indexable iteration cursor. So what we are really talking about is not the integer I over here, like a 1 over here, but rather we're talking about this cursor objects, which is so we talk about uncompatible types. Okay. So now how should we fix it? So there are 2 ways to fix it, right? Either we simply have to say dot item. That's one way to go. Okay, let me just make sure it compiles. And another way to go is I would suggest you simply change this keyword from S to is. So let me show you how to do it. Okay, let me just do another one here. Check result n. Let me do something that's exactly the same over here. But now what I'm going to do is let me just copy this block of code just to save some typing. You can do the same. So now rather than list number 1, I'm going to say list number 2. Okay, list number 2, and also list number 2, list number 2, and list number 2, and list number 2. Okay, everything's still good. But now that's something I will recommend. Every time once you get, okay, recall how we did it. Every time when you say across and hit enter, replace this S by is immediately. Just do it. Okay. Once you get used to it, you wouldn't forget. So once you have done this, you wouldn't run into that compilation error I just showed to you. Okay. Assuming that you have done it. Okay. Let me just delete this. I just show you how you can do it. Let's say we have done that. So now I will change this to is over here. So that means if I simply say li over here, let me make a very important note for you. Li does not denote a cursor anymore. Denotes an integer. And this integer here is simply a member of the interval. And the interval is simply between 1 and a count. Okay? So now if I try to compile, okay, everything compiles. Okay, notice one thing here. When you choose the dummy variable name, li over here is independent from the li over here because they are in a non-overlapping scope. So they are not really conflicting with each other. Okay? So now let's just make sure everything is still run and we get a green bar. That's very good. Okay, so that's about using over here. I just give you one option there about how you can specify for the iterable objects over here, right? So what I just showed to you was the integer interval, so you can definitely use it. Another way to do it is rather than using indices, like integer intervals, I can use collection. And the collection here can be any iPhone-based collection. Can be, for example, at least array, array2, and also hash table, two-way sorted list, and etc. Okay, let me just show you the array version over here. Let's say I still want to copy over from the array into the list. Why don't I just create another list? So we got 3 lists, indicating we got 3 versions of copying for you. Okay, now how can I do it? Okay, it's going to be very similar. So now if I say create list3.make, okay, so now I'm going to say across, okay, I'm going to change this to is immediately, okay? And then, now rather than putting an interval as before, I'm just going to put a directly. And a is an array, which is iterable, okay? And then I would say every member of array A should be a name. So now, again, if I say name over here, for example, I'm gonna get compilation error, okay? Because it says that the loop variable name, which is name, over here clashes with some predefined variable. If you look at a flat view of this particular class, you will see it clashes with one of the feature name of the ancestor class, okay? That's something you can verify yourself. So I would suggest for the dummy variable name, you can always have some prefix. It doesn't have to be L underscore, but it's just one possibility, okay? If I do that, so now compilation will be okay. So let me just do this here. First of all, A being an array, so A is the A I'm talking about over here, it's just a local variable name. A being an array is iterable. And then L name over here denotes a member string of the array, just one of them. However, on the other hand, if you forgot to actually change from S to is, if you simply put S over here, in that case, L name will be a cursor to string rather than string directly. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, but from now on, I'm just always, hopefully I'll remember, I'll always try to change from S to is, just much simpler, so I don't have to say .item always. So now how can we copy that over? So now very similar, so now I'll say list number 3 dot extend. So now since there's no index anymore, so I'll simply say, well, should I say maybe just L name, right, over here, because L name is referring to a string directly. So why don't I just say L name, right? You can think about L name is simply a member of A. Imagine that if A, of course the diagram is about integer, but that's fine. Imagine A is actually referring to a member of the array. So for the first iteration, it's going to refer to the first element, second iteration, second elements, and so on. Okay, so now it's going to work. Okay, and then I'm just going to copy this particular test over here just for our convenience. Okay, and then I will change from list number 2 to list number 3. Okay, let's do that. List number 3 here, list number 3 here, and list number 3 here, and list number 3 here. Okay, let me compile and then run workbench system. Okay, so everything works. So let me recap what you have learned in this particular tutorial video. In this particular tutorial video, we learned about there is a way to use the cross loop, very analogous to the for each loop in Java. By default, if you simply use a code completion feature in iFlow Studio, it's going to give you the version using S. Okay, and notice that there's a loop. So we are really running a loop. So there will be 1, 2, and 3 parts for you to fill in. And the trickiest bit is really about this part here, right? But anything that you can put in here can be either an interval or it can be a collection. And then whatever you put here for the S version will be a cursor indirectly. Whereas if you changed S to is, this will be the member value directly rather than the cursor. So if you really are worried that you may just forget to say the item, in which case you'll get compilation error, then I would suggest you always change from S to is right away, as I demonstrated before. Okay, review this, and then in the next video we'll see how to use the across keyword for writing contracts, because contracts are Boolean expressions, so we have to use a slightly different variance of the across keyword for writing Boolean expressions.